Good afternoon. If you're just logging on, I want to welcome you. We'll hang on just a few minutes as other people are logging on. Hi, I want to welcome everyone. If you're just logging on, we're going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes and make sure everyone has a chance to log on. Thank you. Hi, if you're just logging on, we're going to wait 1 more minute and then we'll begin. Just want to make sure everyone has a chance to log on. Thank you. I think we're ready to begin today's program. Good afternoon. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I want to welcome everyone to today's program, What is Moral Leadership? This is a question that has very much been on my mind as we have navigated through so much turmoil and what are widely perceived to be public transgressions of morality that we have been witnessing these last years. I want to extend my gratitude to the Oregon Justice Resource Center and WorldOregon for co-sponsoring today's program. These are organizations that share OJMCHE's values and with whom I am always grateful to partner with. I also want to remind you of some additional events on the museum's program, again on the museum's calendar, again co-sponsored with WorldOregon and also with the Oregon Historical Society. Together on November 11th, we're going to be hosting a program with Susan Nyman, director of the Einstein Institute in Berlin. Susan's going to be talking about her newest book, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, in which she explores the process of working off the past by which Germany has confronted its history of Nazism, and by way of comparison, how the United States might do the same with its legacy of slavery and contemporary racism. On November 17th, we're going to be offering a program with Leonard Zeskind, Eleanor Langer, and Stephen Wasserstrom, From There to Here, Understanding White Nationalism. This program's timed to honor the memory of Mulugeta Sirah, an Ethiopian immigrant who was murdered by skinheads in Portland on November 14th, 1987. Details of all of these programs are on our website. We offer all of our virtual programming, including today's event, without charge. We'd be so grateful for any donation you might be able to make to help us or our partners, WorldOregon and the Oregon Justice Resource Center, meet our costs. I'm reminded that in the scheme of things, democracy is a relatively new concept to our world, or at least the modern notion of democracy. We credit the Greeks with the first democracy in Athens in the 6th century BCE, but it took revolutions in the United States and France to bring democracy to more of the world. That's about a 2,500-year gap between the first democracy in Athens and American democracy. A functioning democracy is tied to moral leadership, and I wonder whether this might give us a modicum of hope that the attributes of moral leadership, accountability, truth, vulnerability, that seem so fleeting at this particular time are still achievable. We are so fortunate to have 3 exemplary panelists, Alexis Herr from the University of San Francisco, Patricia Schechter from Portland State University, and Bobbin Singh from the Oregon Justice Resource Center, with us today to help us think historically, in the present, and about the future regarding these issues. It is my deepest pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Tim DuRoche, Director of Programs at WorldOregon, who will moderate today's program and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Today's discussion was inspired by the question of not only what is moral leadership, but how is moral leadership in everyday decisions, and especially in the face of crises, looking at historical moments of crisis and change, the Holocaust and other genocides, the civil rights movement, and the fight for gender equality. What were defining actions that helped reclaim a moral center? Moving the discussion from a conversation of just us to a more inclusive vision of justice. These are the kind of important questions that shape the mission of both the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education and WorldOregon, and help connect us to both our shared past, present, and future. And I want to thank Judy for spearheading today's talk. As WorldOregon is a nonprofit or a nonpartisan organization and a nonprofit, I do hope, even with the nail-biting election upon us, that as we move into questions and discussion, we're able to keep our focus on the ideas and values in today's topics. I think slings and arrows are easy, but engaging the questions takes work, and that's why we're here. Many people, myself included, have been frustrated over the past few decades to see the words moral and morality often used to marginalize rather than empower a broader vision of common good. An authentic moral leadership builds trust, inspires communities, creates meaning and purpose, helping people imagine a better future. Globally, however, we are seeing a rise in authoritarian leadership, which too often is fueled by misplaced moral fear and panic and is moral leadership's opposite. Amplifying a greater we is one of those challenges, since it is not enough to simply condemn injustice and hate. Ethical and just leadership must take up the mantle of building a moral alternative to fear. So how is collective moral leadership built in a way that channels, to paraphrase Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, our mourning into a movement and our pain into purpose? One of my nonprofit heroes, the Ford Foundation's Darren Walker, recently noted, "By moral leadership, I do not mean the kind that moralizes. We don't need self-righteousness, but selflessness. Every one of our ongoing crises has been compounded by choices made and not made." In the midst of the civil rights movement, James Baldwin said, "History does not refer merely to the past. History is literally present in all that we do." And with that, Walker aptly framed moral leadership's quandary by saying, like the leaders who came before us, we're caught between the history from which we emerge and the history to which we aspire. So today's question is, how do we understand the lessons of the past, and what does a more level path look like for our shared future? With that, I'd like to invite our panelists to share their brief thoughts on specific historic and cultural periods where moral leadership was challenged and how that inspiration has shaped the work they do. And we look forward to your questions, which you can put into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen after a good round robin between our esteemed panelists. And we're going to begin with Alexis Herr.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Tim, for this introduction. I am so excited to be speaking with you all today about this topic of moral leadership. And when I was invited to do the talk, I started thinking about what does that mean to me, particularly in my field as a scholar of genocide and the Holocaust. And actually, one of the things that I started to think about was when I first was learning about Nazi trials after the Holocaust. And in particular, there was a trial that took place in 1945. It was of 18 physicians who had all participated in the euthanasia project, which required that they murder by injection. I believe it was around 100 or around 100 children who were deemed unfit or unworthy of life. And in the trial of these, after the Holocaust, in the trial of these 18 physicians, every single one of them, when asked whether or not they were guilty of having done this act, they all said that they were not guilty. They all said no. And it made me think about, why were they saying they weren't guilty? This is embarrassing, but when I was a teenager, I was arrested for using a fake ID to try to get into a bar. And I had to go to court. And I remember I had to plead not guilty in order to avoid having to have a harsher sentencing. And so I thought about that. And I remember at the time, I thought that was so weird. I had committed this crime, but I had to say that I hadn't in order to avoid punishment. So when I was reading about these Nazis as an adult, far from this, young age of 18, I was wondering, were they like me? Were they trying to avoid maybe a harsher punishment? And now that I have been studying this topic for more than 15 years, I know that wasn't the case. These individuals claim that they were not guilty, not because they were trying to avoid strict sentencing, but because they truly believed that the people that they murdered were not fully human. And that reflects what the ethics were of the time in Nazi Germany. From their point of view, legally, they had not committed a crime because their government had stipulated that it was indeed ethical and even moral to murder these individuals. And this is one of the challenges of making a distinction between what does it mean to be ethical and what does it mean to be moral. Ethics, I like to think about it as E for everybody. Ethics is typically the ideals of what is right and wrong as defined by your nation, by whatever form of law in which you exist. Morals, I think about as M, me, right? This is what your personal guiding system is. So even in a situation like Nazi Germany, where the ethics of society were telling everyone that it was indeed correct and for the betterment of all Germans, if they were to eliminate anyone who had a differing political perspective or anyone who was deemed inferior because of their ethnicity, their race, or their religion, there were still individuals who, for some reason within their own moral code, decided to do something and say no. And the truth is that those people are incredibly inspiring to me, and I always try to include them in any course I teach, because without them, it would be easy to lose hope. Because when the world turns against humanity, it's leaders who have this moral compass, this moral urge to do something, to break the ethical bounds of the society in which they live and do something remarkable. And it doesn't always end well for those individuals. Sophie Schull was a young woman who was in Germany. She was considered Aryan, so she was not slated for annihilation in any means. She and her brother had joined the Hitler Youth just like she had as a young girl, had drank the Kool-Aid. And then it became clear that the Jews who were being removed from their society were actually being sent for annihilation. And she decided, along with her brother and some of his friends, to start a resistance movement. And their resistance movement was small. It was literally, their plan was just to try to get out information. They wanted to say that it is immoral, it is against God's will for there to be war and mass murder. And for this, they were eventually arrested and sentenced to death. But their story remains important to everybody who studies this history. It is a reminder that ethics, however they are defined by your state, shouldn't determine what your own morals are.
Great, thanks a lot, Alexis. We're gonna move along, and we're gonna have Patricia join us now. And then what we'll do is we'll thread back after all three of you have spoken, and we'll get some conversation going between us all.
Thank you so much, Tim and Judy and my esteemed panelists today, and all the audience members for taking the time to be together to do some reflection. Sort of building off Alexis's very provocative discussion, bracing discussion, I guess where I step off as a historian and as a citizen is that for me, moral leadership is most visible and also hardest to document as a scholar in moments of conflict. In other words, as Alexis described, communities have their standards, right? But when moral leadership, when that compass is really visible and becomes sort of conventionally documentable, it's often in how to navigate conflict or disconnect between people. So moral leadership for me inheres precisely in those spaces where humans are having to navigate disagreement, conflict, and disconnection. So my discussion today is going to spotlight a moment of disconnection because it's very resonant, I think, for the present, and very motivating for us to embrace the challenge of moral leadership. So in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the Voting Rights Amendment, the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, I'm going to share a series of very short letters written 101 years ago this month, October 1920, between two women who were suffragists. And women who were suffragists 101 years ago were women who advocated and tried to exercise, and then did exercise, the right to vote as citizens of the United States. I always tell my students that the past comes to us in pieces. And we're going to drop into these fragments. We're going to try to just listen in for a minute as two women in October 1920 try to navigate a point of disconnection. And because this is, there will be a quiz at the end of, I'm only kidding, at the end of this little test. So the first speaker you will hear is a woman named Anna Clemens, who lived in Southport, North Carolina, which is on the coast near Wilmington, very close to South Carolina, in fact. She came from a large, upstanding, church-going family, and she worked as a nurse for many years. And in her African-American community, nurses were often repositories of great wisdom and tradition in the community, and in extended family networks, they were a position of wisdom and trust, and some mobility too, because it was like visiting nursing. Clemens was active in World War I. She volunteered for the Red Cross, and she even earned a citation for her patriotic duty after the war. The second speaker you'll hear is a woman named Emma Wald, with a W. She was the daughter of Norwegian immigrants, born in South Dakota, but she was educated right here in Oregon. So there's a little local link with Emma Wald. She attended the University of Oregon. She got an undergraduate degree and a master's and eventually a law degree, although that degree she did not get here. She taught high school in Eugene, and she was very active in Oregon's suffrage fights of 1908 and 1912. And her activism eventually took her into the ranks of something called the National Woman's Party, which was a group that organized right after the 19th Amendment was passed to kind of capture and mobilize the female electorate, the new female electorate. So when we parachute into this little exchange of letters, there are 5 of them, they're quite short. Wald is actually on the staff of the National Woman's Party, and she's the head of the legislative bureau of the NWP, and it's in that capacity that Anna Clemens is writing these letters 101 years ago this month to Washington, D.C. on the issue of voting. So, October 10th, 1920, Southport, North Carolina. To the Secretary of the National Woman's Party. I am an American colored woman, a property owner in Brunswick County, state of North Carolina, and I'm seeking a way to vote by mail, if there is a way, because a colored person in my county is unable to vote because they are colored. Please send me information on how to send votes or how to register to General Headquarters by mail before it's too late to register. I'm yours obliged, Anna Clemens. 10 days later, from Ms. Wald. My dear Ms. Clemens, your letter of October 10th inquiring about registration and voting by mail in North Carolina has just come to my hands. Registration must be made in person in North Carolina in the precinct in which you live. It's possible to vote by mail on applying for a ballot to the county board. Registrations close on October 23rd, and as you undoubtedly understand, no one may register or vote outside of his precinct. We have been making inquiries and learned that colored women are being registered in North Carolina. Have you tried personally? If not, will you try to let us know the result? Should the registration board refuse to register you, we shall be glad to look into the matter and see what can be done about it. Very sincerely yours, Emma Wald. 3 days later, October 24th, 1920. My dear Miss Wald, In reply to your letter, which was duly received yesterday, I would take the greatest pleasure to write you my result. I say I will take the greatest pleasure to write you my result in attempting to register. I went before the registrar on October 15th and was refused, as this board requires all colored to be able to read and write to suit, she puts quotation marks, the registrar. And all persons of colored origin in this whole county have been unable to suit the registrar. North Carolina laws require one to be able to read and write to register, and we still have in our county ones who fill those requirements and then are refused. I hope and ask if you should have this matter investigated. Please do not let my name be brought into this matter because there is so much prejudice existing. I am most assured I will be victim of a lawless mob. To show that that I am no agitator, I will try to explain my position. I am a nurse. I have nursed in almost every home in this town for the past 9 years, acting at times as assistant to one of the South's best surgeons. I donated to the Red Cross, volunteered during the epidemic of 1918, the flu, she puts in quotation marks, and I hold a certificate for heroic services rendered over my state. I own my own property and pay my tax. I am a Christian belonging to the Methodist Church. I tend to my own business and I don't interfere with any race of people. I try to live as I expect to live when I pass into the great beyond, and that is in peace. I have 7 brothers, law-abiding, supposed to, quotation mark, citizens, denied the same as myself. In other words, denied the right to vote myself. Hoping and resting assured you will not use my name in this matter, I will close. And last letter. Dear Ms. Clemens, from November 2nd. I have called Ms. Paul's attention, head of the Women's Party, to your letter of October 24th describing the registration conditions for colored women in your neighborhood. We have been giving the situation in the South a good deal of thought, but at present we see only one solution to the matter, and that is one which is not available now. We feel that we must pass through Congress an enabling act which will place federal authority over the registration and election officials in all states. We had hoped and so making interference with or prevention of proper execution of the election laws a federal offense. We had hoped to get this enabling act through Congress before its adjournment last spring, but did not get farther than introducing the measure. We expect to be able to work for the passage of this act in the coming session of Congress. Very sincerely yours, Emma Wald. So, voter suppression, the somewhat talking past each other quality of this conversation, and the stark difference between women of privilege who understand hiccups in the system to be amenable to administrative adjustment, and I am all in favor of administrative adjustment, and those in our society, in our country, for whom their very lives are at stake, that voting is a matter of life and death, and protesting and trying to secure their rights of vote could literally put their lives in jeopardy. That is an opportunity for moral leadership then. It was then, and it remains in our own time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Patricia. Let's jump in with Bobbin Singh and keep it rolling.
Well, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I'm always excited to participate with Judy, or anything she asks me to do. I'm always happy to oblige, just because I have so much respect for the museum and all the work that they do and the conversations that they try to foster in our community. And this is my second time being able to engage with Tim, so it's always fun being able to have him moderate and facilitate a conversation, because I think he brings out the best in all the speakers. So my name is Bobbin Singh. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. It's a nonprofit law firm based in Portland, Oregon. And essentially what we do is we try to frustrate mass incarceration and white supremacy through legal services and through litigation. We operate 5 different legal programs that provide legal services at no cost to individuals navigating the system or who have been harmed by state actors or the system or other actors. I think most relevant for today's conversation is a lot of the work that we've done since the Black Lives Matter protests really started after the murder of George Floyd, is our representation of protesters against the city for violence and harms caused by local law enforcement. That's really been a tremendous focus of our work over the past 6 months or 5 months now, in addition to representing individuals who are incarcerated in our prisons due to the COVID pandemic, and trying to ensure that the harms presented by COVID are mitigated to the fullest extent possible. That's sort of on each end of where we're working. So I like to say, from the streets to the prisons, we're somehow involved in trying to push back against the harms created by our systems. And it also includes some litigation that we've initiated against the alt-right or far-right groups that have come into Portland and harms that they've caused. So what this has done is it's really given us an opportunity for me to understand the diversity of ways in which different segments of our population are experiencing our society or harms in our society. And, you know, when I was asked to speak on this panel, and especially over the past week when we've been able to meet as, you know, as a pre-panel or a pre-discussion conversation about what we're going to talk about, I've been really trying to meditate on this idea of what is moral leadership. And, you know, listening to Patricia and Alexis and what they bring to this, the things that I really want to focus on is sort of the present and what I'm observing, at least from my perspective, working on civil rights and racial justice from a legal organization. And I think, to me, what I think has been revealing over these past months especially is what COVID and also the racial justice movement has helped reveal and expose is, I think, a corruption that exists in our society, a corruption that values property and money over the value and dignity of individuals. And that has been exacerbated. And we see that, I think we see that across from institutions like law enforcement all the way to our prisons, where we have all been forced in this sort of emergency environment, in this crisis environment. We tend to retreat back to our natural instincts or our core values. And I think what's been revealed to us through the practices of law enforcement, through the practices of some elected leaders, through the practices of our institutions like prison, is that natural instinct, it reverts back to an ideology that created this country, that created this state, which is white supremacy. This idea of dominating and controlling certain segments of our population based on this idea of what Alexis brought up, that people are just somehow are legally less than. In the United States, I think in this country, we're talking about both a legal fiction that exists because it's not on its face that we're saying people are less than, but we've created legal structures that ensure that there are certain populations that cannot fully participate in our society for whatever reason it may be. And a lot of that is based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, political ideology now. And I think that ideology also gives it permission for folks to be able to allow that ideology to be normalized, to say that this is okay. I think, again, what Alexis was, you know, mentioning, and some of what Patricia was, I think, surfacing in the letters that she had mentioned. And so I think what we've seen over this past 6 months since COVID hit is a real revelation of what our societal values are in this country. And then we began to ask, what is moral leadership in this moment? Because once these values are exposed to us, I think this leads me to my second point, which is, what do we do? How do we respond? Like, what is the moment? Do we recognize the moment? Is there, you know, I think moral leadership syncs up to timing and opportunity and understanding power and how to use your power in those moments. And I think what we've seen over the past 6 months, unfortunately, from our perspective, is a vacuum. We have so many individuals in our society that have power to actually change things, to mitigate harm, to bring people together, to protect democracy. And we have created sort of fictional anchors or fictional barriers that prevent us from actually moving forward. I'm often reminded of, I'm sure people who are on social media have seen this, but there's, I think, a horse or a donkey tied to a stick with a string. And the horse is not moving because it's tied to this tiny little stick because it's been psychologically conditioned to believe that it can't move. And I feel like that's where we're at as a country, that when we're talking about white supremacy and racial justice and even our response to COVID, that we've created these barriers, these fictional barriers that don't actually exist, that prevent us from moving and prevent people from actually exercising power to be able to move. And what continues to be sort of surprising to me, and I think I'm still a little bit raw from things that happened here in Portland last night with the city council vote, is moral leadership, I think, for me, is a combination of understanding the moment, the opportunity, and again, the power that you have to be able to move things. And it's not exercising that power when you have the opportunity. And I think as a country, what we've learned is, you know, windows open and close. I think, you know, unless we're willing to actually exercise and fully lean into the powers that we have as individuals, as organizations, as public officials, and use that power with a value system that's rooted in dignity, compassion, restoration, regeneration, you know, we will miss those opportunities. There's always this tendency of wanting to kick the can down the road, to say, let's wait for a better political moment to have this conversation. Let's not disrupt this other opportunity to have this conversation. And it's usually economic opportunities or opportunities that protect property and wealth at the sacrifice of racial justice or dignity of individuals. And I think we've come to a crossroads in our country right now where we can no longer sustain that trajectory, that we have to accept these root ideologies that created this country and how they've percolated and how they've sort of manifested itself into our institutions and policies and practices. And I think what we see in protests and other people that are out there advocating in whichever way that they can is a desire to confront this, is finally a desire to actually do this, and to challenge this and to change the systems. And I think one of the things that has come to me most recently in doing this work is that the systems that we've created have largely been created based on these ideologies and fictions and stereotypes without being actually grounded in facts or science or evidence. And also understanding that evidence and social science and these facts evolve. Like, we have to be, as a society, be willing to evolve with our understandings as well, and be willing to change our policies and practices with that evolution of knowledge. If we don't sync those up, you know, I think we end up in the situation in which we're in. So, you know, these are just some rambling thoughts, but I think like the big thing that for me, which has really come to bear, is the unwillingness to embrace the power that people have, the unwillingness to actually use the values of dignity and compassion, and again, like restoration, to guide our decision-making. Even if we don't know what's on the other side of that decision, if we ground our decision in those values, I think we can be confident that the other side of it will lead us to a better place than not doing anything. And I think standing still, being silent, is right now one of the most harmful things that can happen. And so, you know, when we talk about moral leadership, I think moral leadership is recognizing, again, this time, opportunity, and the powers that we have individually or collectively to be able to make change. And so the last thing that I'll really that's really sort of come to me, and I think this partly stemmed out of the conversation we were having in preparing for this panel, is a colleague of mine has expressed to me this recognition of this moment of what we're really in. And I think that understanding it helped liberate me and helped me become more focused in our work. And I think the way he framed it, or some way like this, the way I've taken his framing of it, is we get the opportunity right now to plant the seed for a tree that our next generation can enjoy the shade of, so to speak. So we may not be able to get to enjoy the full sort of spectrum of freedoms or rights or you know, treatments that we aspire or imagine that can exist, but we get to fight for that generation that comes after us. And I think when we talk about moral leadership, not only recognizing the moments that we're in, but then understanding how do we live for something beyond ourselves or work for something beyond ourselves, is, I think, falls squarely into sort of like the center of what moral leadership is. And what we're talking about is, how do we make the community, how do we make our society better for the people that come after us? And again, once we begin to ask those questions, we began to get to very different solutions. We began to ask ourselves about community well-being, about community health, about the health of the world, about the health of environment, about the health of our society, our neighborhoods, whatever it is. Because how do we leave this in a better place for other people and not be focused on what benefits us now? And I think once we can begin to restructure or reframe those questions, then again, we get to different solutions. So, you know, from our perspective, that's really a lot of what we try to do on the work and around the civil rights work that we've been doing here in Oregon, and along with our colleagues nationally, is really trying to think about how to reframe the conversations that we're having so we can put ourselves on a path, and on a different path and a different trajectory than what we're currently on. So those are just some random thoughts that I had about moral leadership and how it connects to the work that we have, that we're doing here. But I'll just leave it at that. And I'm sorry, my thoughts aren't as coherent as Alexis or Patricia, but like I said, it seems like right now we're living in a 24 to 48 hour cycle of events and responses. And, you know, I had some thoughts prepared last night, and then a bunch of things happened yesterday, and it sort of threw me for a loop. And so, yeah, I'm presenting more raw and more improvised today than I initially thought. But thank you for the opportunity to be able to just share some initial thoughts, and I look forward to some of the follow-up questions.
No, Bobbin, that was wonderful. I mean, in some ways, what you got at is sort of what I started the program with, and we have not so much a question, but a comment from somebody that you hit on the how, maybe not the what, but you know, instead of thinking of moral leadership as purely a noun, you got at the verb. So I'm wondering if Patricia and Alexis could, because I feel like, Bob, you really framed the how of this really wonderfully. If Patricia and Alexis could talk a little bit more of the how of moral leadership.
Absolutely. And, you know, Bobbin, I was taking notes as you wrote, because what your comments made me think about was how similar in many ways moral leadership is or can be with resistance, particularly when you're examining cases of genocide. What I always tell people when I'm teaching students, and they're like, you know, what's happening to the Rohingya is so large. What can I do? I can't do anything. There's this sense of disillusionment in terms of what their personal power is. And one of the things that I always remind them is that we are diverse as people. We have different strengths. None of us are the same. And the way that we can uphold human rights is diverse, just like we are. So it's about finding opportunities within your strengths to do something of action. I think about when I was talking before, I was talking about moral leadership during the Holocaust, and I was looking at people who were not slated for victimization. I was talking about Aryans, right? Well, there were Jews who were also being persecuted, who found avenues to resist, but also exhibit moral leadership. One of the first people who comes to mind is this woman. Her name is Herr, and she was in the Vilna ghetto. I know about her through her daughter. She was an intellectual. She spoke many different languages. And when she went into the Vilna ghetto, she was recruited by the Germans to actually go into YIVO, which was an archive of Jewish history, and actually pull out materials that would be sent back to Germany and be used in a museum about this extinguished race that would one day be open. And so she was with another, couple other scholars, and they started, to feel the weight of the activities they were doing. The materials that they didn't select to be sent on to this museum about the, murdered race were all going to be destroyed. And so instead, what she started to do was sneak documents on her person back into the ghetto. With the hope that they could restore or hide these kind of artifacts of Jewish identity and keep them so that maybe one day they could have new life. Now, the actions that she did definitely did not stop the Holocaust. They didn't save anyone's life, but she was exhibiting agency through the materials and through her situation. She found a way to be present and to respond. And these materials that she saved, along with the other members of this group that she was of, now are part of the YIVO archives that anyone who's doing research on Jews will definitely go and explore. And so, for me, moral leadership is, there's not a one size fit all, there's not a one definition, but it's about finding agency that you possess as an individual and using it to the advantage of everyone around you.
Great, that was awesome. Patricia, your thought?
Thank you. Perhaps I'll be a little more tentative than Alexis's wonderful discussion. I guess the how has to do with sort of believing the person who comes to you with a story, rather than displacing or reframing or passing along what they're telling you to some other structure or some other process, right? So what Emma Wald says to Anna Clemens is, you're telling me your life's in danger, and all I've got up here is wait till we can pass the right law that will be administered in a more just fashion. To me, that's a displacement, right? And so leaning into someone's story means taking their story seriously, trusting their story, and then acting on it the best you can. And someone could say, well, Emma Wald acted on it the best she could. I think we're in a moment now where we need more than that. We need more than a checking a box and we'll file it away and we'll push on it, slowly. And, I think that those are good too. Sometimes those are important too. Eventually, right? One of my qualities of moral leadership for myself is persistence. And things don't come easily. They don't come quickly either. But I think in the immediate moment we're in with one another as neighbors, as family members, as people that we work with, is really believe that person's story who's coming to you. And respond in the moment as fully as you can. And that I think it makes a difference. I think it makes a difference in the quality of spirit and the quality of hope and the quality of trust. Even if you fail them in the short term, you're not a miracle worker. You can't get to South Carolina or North Carolina. I just think it's better. We need more now. And so taking someone's story seriously, taking it as your own story for a minute, respectfully, can make that transformational shift that I think, so I'll say I know I need, and I try to practice.
So the dismantling, the workaround, the confronting of structures. Bobbin, you mentioned the sort of power structures we're up against. Patricia, you're looking at what was the reality for these two disparate people at that moment. The beautiful workaround of the everyday hero, Alexis, that you mentioned. We often think of the sort of moral leader as, the kings, the Gandhis, but it's the woman that you mentioned. It's the librarians of Timbuktu who got all of the Islamic manuscripts out, so they weren't destroyed. But we've got a question here. This is kind of a roundabout way to a question, which is that wealth and income inequalities disrupt societies that are both perpetuated and exacerbated by hierarchies determined by access to political, financial, and social capital. So how can we expect individual morality to prevail if the ethics of society uphold and reward unjust and anti-democratic actions by a more powerful or wealthy elite? And you feel free to jump in at any point, any of you. Let's make this informal. Let's pretend we're sitting around the kitchen table with coffee.
I'll jump in. That's I think a complicated question, but I think for me, it really goes about looking at this root ideology that existed, that created this country, that even created the state of Oregon, this ideology of white supremacy. I think it all comes down to a fundamental ideology of dominance and control, or dominating control. And that's largely based off race and thinking that there are, and sexism, largely this idea that unless you are a white Protestant male, everything else is beneath you. Everything else is subservient to that. There's a hierarchical racial structure that exists. And then from that, there's been these manifestations or structures that have been created that have helped try to implement that ideology. So I think by us actually focusing our attention on that ideology and beginning to recognize it as flawed, and then doing the hard work, and Brian Stevenson talks about this, like this idea of truth and reconciliation being these sequential acts. Like we can never get to reconciliation unless we focus on the truth first. And what we have too often is, as a society and public officials, wanting to jump to efforts of reconciliation before the truth-telling part of it. So there'll be symbol or gestures or even laws that will attempt to offer reconciliation towards problems or issues that we're facing as a society. But because we haven't done that actual hard work of the truth-telling, those efforts fall flat or are insufficient. So I think first and foremost, it's just understanding how does white supremacy impact our country? How does it percolate into the practices and policies that we see today? What are those infrastructures or tentacles of white supremacy that exist? And that extends into sort of our economic system of capitalism as well, because that exacerbates that ideology. It's built on that system here in this country. So I think before we get to like any solutions, I don't know that I have any. I think the first thing is, as a community, as a society, as a country, we need to confront this sort of this original sin of this country and begin to address that openly and honestly. And I think once we do that, we will then have solutions reveal themselves to us, because there is a diversity of both intellectual power and perspectives and experiences in this country that will be able to, I think, illuminate different types of ways in which we can move forward that ensures inclusivity and, again, fair treatment of everyone, and also the dignity and value of everyone. And once we can get to there, once we can confront that ideology, I think we can get to the other part. But I think we're still, as a country and as a society, struggling to even admit what the problem is.
Yeah, I would love to just chime in. It's beautifully stated by Bobbin. I mean, I think it's, again, back to my little theme here of listening deeply to each other's stories and believing them. And one of the things that I think people of privilege have been not good at is narrating their own identities in relationship to white supremacy. Anna Clemens in South Carolina has no choice but to narrate her life in relationship to white supremacy. Emma Wald doesn't feel so compelled, right? To her, it's just the right policy with the right enforcement. She's not narrating. Her response to a story about my relationship to white supremacy is this. Emma Wald does not respond with a story says, my relationship to white supremacy is that, right? So listening to each other's stories, making space for that is a first step. And I think I see a lot of this in Portland already, where yes, the forces are consolidated and large over our heads, but I see everyday people disconnecting from routine participation in the validation of those systems, like withdrawing from my own 16-year-old, trying to withdraw from the fast fashion part of consumerism, right? Or introducing barter economies in neighborhoods where people share all kinds of things, the produce from their gardens, childcare, services, tools. So I think there are ways that people are withdrawing, slowly withdrawing from, the best we can, from some of these routine ways that we validate capitalism. We're kind of forced to do so, right? They hold all the goodies. The system holds all the goodies that we think we need, right? But being really active and mindful, I think I see our young people withdrawing from a lot of that, refusing to participate in their livelihood, like for their jobs. They're not going to sell things, right? So they make things. So I think these small ways can accumulate. I believe that. You can see it historically. I could talk about workers' cooperatives later. That's another session, Judy.
And just to add here, you know, one of the things that I find like continues to rattle my brain is a quote from Vicki Barnett, who's a scholar of the Holocaust. And basically she writes that during the Holocaust, the vast majority of people were neither perpetrators or victims, they were bystanders. The Holocaust could not have happened. 6 million Jews and 11 million people would not have died had it not been for millions more doing nothing, feeling uninspired or fearful or just not caring. And so that is, for me, one of the most important and crucial lessons of any time. I have been so inspired this year by Black Lives Matter protests. I can't even tell you, I get goosebumps thinking about it, because for me, it is the first time in my life that I have seen such a vocal engagement with changing the discourse of civil rights within our country. And I find it incredibly inspiring, because we, as an American, I am lucky enough to live in a democracy where people do have the power. The balance right now of power is worrisome. I know this person who asked the question, as well as some of the other questions that are in the question box, are talking about kind of this imbalance of power in our society, and it is worrisome. However, the people have the power. We have the power to elect whomever we decide to elect. On top of that, you know, we are in a world that's connected in ways that it didn't it wasn't before. If you care about the environment, or if you care about civil rights, or you care about women's rights, if you care, whatever it is you care about, I guarantee you, you can find someone within your community who will stand with you on that issue. And so it is up to you to find that network and become part of it, and to help it have strength in numbers. And you can access these groups by looking for them on Facebook, by looking on them on Twitter, on social media, following organizations like those who are present today. Will help you connect with the people who you can help manifest your power with.
So that brings up, we've got a question here, and I know people always love the sort of bullet point, what can I do, 1, 2, 3, but you bring this up, which is how can we show moral leadership outside the world of politics, yet bring weight to the issue? And I'll add to weight the accountability and the responsibility to that issue. And I'd love, if each of you have, 1 or 2 thoughts on tools, strategies, some concrete things that people can think about.
For me, I think this is a tough question, because I think we've entered an environment where it's very difficult to disconnect the political from the non-political. I think standing up for human dignity, standing up for inclusive democracy, standing up for the fair and equitable treatment of all of our neighbors and members of our community is a politically provocative act these days. Like it is the thing that is required of all of us, I think, to be able to do. So it's hard for me to disconnect the two, just generally speaking. I understand the question. So what I want to focus on then is, I think outside the political process or outside political parties, is there a way, what are some things that, or how do people engage in this? And I think it goes back again to understanding your power. Everything that we've created in our community, everything that we've created in our society, our structures, our political processes, the institutions, these were all created by us. These are all basically manifestations of our either imagination or a buildup or culmination of ideas that are based and rooted in, I think, not very good, sound ideas. I mean, when you look at the criminal legal system, it's a series of systems that start from arrest all the way through reentry that include multiple actors. But all these systems have been built up on basically fictional ideologies or fictional principles. And we're now beginning to course correct, even just incrementally, but begin to course correct around what social science and data and human behavior how it actually works. But it goes to show that these institutions were created by individuals. They can be taken down by individuals. They can be reimagined, and we can aspire to something completely different. The only limitation is our imagination. I think the problem is that we've never been asked to imagine something different. Like, we've always been asked to look at the current systems and help us think about how this system could be, quote unquote, better. And I think that's the wrong question we need to be asking. I think what we need to start asking ourselves is, how can we do things differently? How can we actually deconstruct and dismantle what exists and build it back up? And when I say dismantle and deconstruct, I don't mean burn down, tear down, leave vacuums and gaps of services or supports. This will be a lengthy and probably take, the entirety of my professional career to do. So it is a long process that requires, I think, a lot of stamina, but it's worthwhile to begin to think about and imagine what is it that we want to create? What is it that we want to see? And begin working towards that, even in small ways. I think if it's in your own professional career, you can re-examine, if you're looking for different professional opportunities. Even within the professional work that you do, there are probably a host of opportunities that you can do to help think about things differently and participate civically, or help other people in the community. There's a lot of people struggling right now in Oregon, and I think if we begin to imagine a society in which we actually care for each other and treat each other well, then I think a lot of opportunities open up for how to be able to implement or effectuate that, either through donations or through volunteerism, or talking with your neighbors or your family members. But I think it just comes down to us exercising our imagination around the different structures or institutions that exist, and really trying to think about things how it can be different and in a better way that's grounded in values that actually that are really centered around human dignity. I think when we began to look at what I try to imagine is who has the most access in our society, and what does that access allow that person to do? And then almost like a pie chart, where does everyone else stand? And then I began to think about how do we make it so everyone's pie chart is complete and full? And what are those barriers that are preventing us from getting there? And that's where I began sort of my imagination exercise, and try to think about like our work, or even in my personal life, the things that I can begin to do to ensure to move that pie chart so every individual in our community has the ability to fully access the services and opportunities, and again, to realize their full potential and dignity as a human being.
Thank you so much. So wonderful. I'm just going to be very brief. I mean, I'm not a creative person, so you don't necessarily want me imagining, but I just look around. If we look outside the United States, so many people have done things better than we have. Like, I'll just name two. One is dealing with folks who struggle with addiction, and the other is gun control. We've been told endlessly in this country that we don't know how to deal with these two things. It's truly a lie, not a myth, not a fiction. It is a lie, and it is to ingrain inaction. It's to ingrain, and it's like that horse tied to the imaginary stick. It's to make us think we don't know how to do things. We don't have to imagine those too much. The models are there for the taking. And so thinking about outcomes, which I think is really at the heart of what Bobbin's saying, it's like, what are the outcomes we want? Let's start with a healthy society. Let's start with a society where people feel safe in their homes and on their streets and in common areas. And many countries have done far better than we have. And they're there for those models are there for the taking.
So before we jump to Alexis, we have a question that kind of speaks directly to this. First of all, you're an incredibly creative thinker, so don't sell yourself short. But would you speak a little bit about the historian's role in re-examining history to give young people a fresh lens on understanding our present?
Who, me, Tim?
Yes.
So thank you for the question. No, it's absolutely on point, and it's an honor to be in this company and have the chance to say a few words. I mean, I think what I'm seeing is that people are, especially young people, need more room for more heroes at a very basic level. When I see folks pulling down statues, I don't necessarily see, I don't necessarily see a crisis per se. I see people are tired of the same story. The story isn't working for them. And so it's an opportunity. If they're not removing the statue, we're moving them. We're moving them to make room for more, or so that we can convene a conversation about how is it that we got here? Who helped us get here, or who didn't help us get here? Those conversations around monuments and public space, I think, I can't wait till we can gather in more comfortable modes out of doors and think about how do we see our physical landscape? Who was here before? Who built this? Who fought here? Who died here? Who was born here? Once we revisit what we don't know, what we've forgotten, history is alive. History is alive. And the folks of good intentions who are pulling down, there's always a few mischief folks in upsurges and in activism. But I think in the main, my sense is the story is not working for our young people, and we are well advised to bring them into retelling the story.
Great, thanks. Alexis?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a historian of Holocaust and genocide studies, and I'm an activist on this issue. And I will never in my lifetime stop genocide. It won't happen. But it doesn't mean that I won't spend every day of my life trying to move the needle towards that objective. And the reason for that is because there are people who are still suffering today and will continue to do so if no action is taken. Just because we can't solve the problem immediately doesn't mean we should stop trying. When I was in grad school, I had an opportunity to work for an organization called Jewish World Watch in Southern California. And one of the things that they were focused on was how to support refugees who are in camps, refugee camps in Chad and in Sudan who had been impacted by the Darfur genocide. Sudan was not allowing any foreign agencies to come in and actually offer support or aid to these individuals. Journalists couldn't go in and report on what was happening. And so it was this really tricky space to navigate as an activist around this issue, because you couldn't work with the government. Our government wasn't doing enough, nor were many other nations. And so this organization I worked for decided that one of the ways they could help was to support women who were in refugee camps, who were being asked to go outside of the refugee camps to collect firewood so that they could cook food. Now, if they left the camp to try to collect food, they were often raped. If the men went, they would be more likely killed or forcibly recruited to do militia work. And so women had this task. And so it was this really impossible situation. Now, instead of trying to work within our government to try to do more advocacy or try to, enforce more sanctions, which eventually did happen, what they decided to do was figure out a technology that would actually support people now. And that involved creating solar cookers, which are literally like pieces of cardboard that have a reflective surface like tinfoil on them that you can set up and cook food in so that it absolves the need to go outside of the camp to get firewood. While I was working there, I met a young girl who was 9 years old who wanted to do something, but she was 9. And so what she did was she went and collected stones around her neighborhood and painted things on them, like butterflies and like ladybugs, like things that like a 9-year-old would paint, and that I also have no ability to paint. And she went around her neighborhood and in her synagogue, and she sold these rocks. And this little girl ended up raising $250. A solar cooker cost $25 to make. She was able to literally save some women who were in the camp the fear of having to go outside and collect firewood and possibly be raped. It's important to think about moral leadership and action as not something that solves every problem, but as part of the movement. It's a lot like what Bobbin said when he first responded, that, we can plant the tree and we're not going to have the joy of the shade, but that tree, if we nurture it, will grow and it will provide shade. So, my main thing is don't be discouraged by the outlook of the world today, but keep moving towards the world you want to be part of and the world you want to see.
So I'm going to end with one last question. I mean, we've had a lot of, what is, how is, when and where is moral leadership. But I think you've all pointed at, the real power of story. I mean, we gain an understanding of the unbelievable fulcrum that even the smallest decision of moral leadership can have. So who do you hold up as the most influential or important moral leaders? I mean, both historically and contemporaneously, who are the people that inspired you to do what you're doing and continue to inspire you to do what you're doing now?
Well, for me, I had the great fortune of being able to be born and raised in Atlanta, and I was able to be saturated by that history of civil rights and those civil rights leaders from the 50s and 60s that existed. I mean, I joke, it's even in my bio, that the first names that you learn growing up in Atlanta are names like MLK, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, Hosea Williams, so on and so forth. So from a very early age, it was those individuals that really influenced, I think, my perspective as far as how do you respond to injustice? How do you respond to a system that tells you you don't belong? Because for me, being a child of immigrants, growing up in a Sikh household where I, wore a turban until I was the age of 16, our family consistently experienced discrimination, prejudice, bigotry, harassment, threats, so on and so forth. And so I was always looking for tools or people to learn from about how to respond to that. And for me, at least fortunately, that's where I leaned. I mean, there's a diversity of ways in which people can respond to it. And I feel like I was fortunate to be able to stumble into that at an early age. But, for me, I would say that things that have inspired, the people who have inspired me to do this work are a guy named Stephen Bright. He's a founder of the Southern Center for Human Rights out of Atlanta, who is also one of the mentors for Bryan Stevenson. And then Bryan Stevenson, who's the founding director of the Equal Justice Initiative. Those are the big sort of bucket inspirationals, I would say, for me, that really drove me towards this work and trying to understand the connection between white supremacy, racial justice, and mass incarceration. But then I think going back to what Patricia said, the greatest oppression that can occur is not believing someone's story. And, you know, with the clients that we work with and the different advocates that we work with, I think it's the daily inspiration of people that have the resiliency to continue to march forward and to live and to continue to fight, whether it's someone that can survive the experience of prison, survive the experience of police misconduct or abuse, survive immigration detention centers, and, you know, still live. And those advocates that have been working in this space and whose shoulders I stand on, the attorneys and the civil rights advocates for the past 2 or 3 decades that have really helped me basically create the moment that I could come along and do the work that I'm doing. Because without them, I would have never been able to actually exist or do this work. They opened up a path for me to understand that it existed. And for me, it was just for me to just step into it. So I would say it's, you know, a combination of all sorts of those things.
That's great. Thank you. Alexis, Patricia?
Sure, I'll go next. I have 2 people who have inspired me to do this work. The first of which is a professor I had when I was an undergrad. His name is John Roth, and he just wrote a book that came out. It's called Sources of Holocaust Insight. He's a philosopher. And one of the main things that he has learned from the Holocaust and the study of genocide, he said, is that people don't always ask the right questions. That if we, you know, find ways within ourselves to ask questions of what is going on around us, we might do better and behave better. When he looks at all these young people who became members of the Nazi Party, who wanted this better Germany, but didn't consider the cost, right? Who had to die in order to make, you know, the Übermensch. That will forever stay with me. If we can do better to expand people's minds and have them ask the right questions of themselves and the world around them, then we will have a better chance at a stronger humanity. And the last one is a Holocaust survivor, Primo Levi, who is an incredible human being. But again, he asks us to remember that we have within us the ability to do great things and horrible things, that we are both good and evil. Evil people don't do bad things, people do bad things. And so these are lessons that I've taken forward and continue to inspire the work that I do.
Thank you very much. And Patricia?
Just a few favorite people. I mean, I have to hold up Michelle and Barack Obama for my midlife inspiration and their continued, I mean, I think I consider them the moral compass of our country. And I love teaching their writings. I love watching them, how they hold themselves in public, the way they use their words, the way they speak is an inspiration to me. Locally, I'm in love with Street Roots. I'm a big fan of their current leadership and their past leadership. My students and I have worked with Street Roots to help them organize their archives and build an exhibit for them, working with vendors, getting to know the staff, an ongoing inspiration for making a difference largely through storytelling and preserving and honoring people's stories, kind of in extremis and what happens after extremis. So Street Roots, much love.
So what I'm hearing is if we keep our ears open, our hearts open, and we look around, we can find moral leadership, both writ small and writ large, pretty much everywhere, but it is being open to it and it's supporting it in all of its manifestations. So I want to thank all of you, and with that, I'm going to bring Judy back on to take us out into this day. So thank you very much, all of you.
A wonderful conversation. I know that Bobbin had to sign off. He had to take a phone call, but I do want to express my profound appreciation to all of you and add you to my list of moral leaders. I think that really it's just so important that we realize it all comes back to us. If each of us uphold the morals of what it means to act with dignity, compassion, listening, and believing the other, standing up, we can make a difference. I always say it's baby steps, but we do have that power. Tim, thank you so much for facilitating. As always, it was brilliant. And Alexis, Patricia, Bobbin, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's participating and listening today. We will be sending out, give us a couple of days, we will send out the recording of this event that you're welcome to share. It's also posted on our website. Someone in the chat asked if the links that other people posted will be available. We'll be sure to put those in the email that goes out as well. Thank you. If you haven't voted, get out there and put your vote in. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.